the presentation. Okay. So let's see here. All right. Sorry, give me 1 second. I got to get it all set back up here. We're going to go backwards before we go forward. All right. Perfect. Can everybody see the screen okay? Can everybody hear me?
Yep. Everything sounds good and looks good.
Perfect. All right. Well, I already told you a little bit about myself, but just before we get started, I started farming about 12 years ago. I started farming in a very similar scale and situation to many of the folks at Big River. My first farm was 1 acre of produce on an incubator farm in Osceola, Wisconsin, which is very close to Big River as well. And I eventually, over the course of 7 or 8 years, scaled up to 15 acres of produce. And what we specialized in at Seed to Seed Farm was selling that produce to only wholesale accounts. Meaning that we weren't selling to farmers markets or CSA, but just going to places like restaurants and school systems and supermarkets and places like that. So I'm going to start by just doing a general overview of wholesale, meaning specifically what is wholesale, the pros and cons, important concepts and the types of wholesale. And by the way, please feel free to raise your hand if I go too quickly. I'm happy to slow down. Here we go. Okay, so first is we just need to define what do we mean by wholesale. And in produce farming, wholesale means you're selling a large quantity of produce to an individual buyer. So the exact amount isn't really important. For some people, it'll be thousands of pounds of produce. For some people, it'll be 10 pounds of produce. However, what you generally need to know is that when you're doing wholesale, you're doing something on a bigger scale. And because of that, it means you're generally going to grow less crops in larger quantities for a smaller number of accounts. So meaning when we look at your classic farmers market or CSA type farm, you might be growing 60, 70, 80 different types of crops. A wholesale farm might be growing anywhere between 5 and 10. So one of the more important concepts is to understand that we're, some of the value we're getting out of wholesale is we might be getting paid a little less for the produce, but there's so much less time in management because we're growing so many fewer crops. And that's where we really get the advantage of being a wholesale grower. So there's pros and cons to wholesale, just like anything, like with any farming or business model. And I think it's important that we're just honest about what they are so we can figure out whether this is the best model for us. So the pros are, it's very high efficiency. You can potentially make more money per acre. And that gives you more money to buy things like high quality equipment and high quality buildings. There's less customers to manage. And you have the ability to not grow crops that you don't like or aren't good at. So for example, on my farm, I was never very good at growing lettuce, but because I was selling wholesale, I didn't have to sell lettuce. I would just sell the crops I was good at. But if I'd gone to the farmer's market, you need to have lettuce because that's what people expect at your stand. The cons to wholesale is it's higher risk. You definitely need more infrastructure and equipment. You're competing more directly with really big farms. It can be a crowded marketplace, and sometimes you'll have to do a lot more paperwork, and we'll get into that in a second. Okay, so important concepts. So like I said before, the point of wholesale is to be as efficient as possible. And that means streamlining your operations. So again, you don't want to end up with the worst of both worlds where you're getting a lower price for your crop, but you're also growing 100 crops, so you can't be efficient at them and you can't save time. So efficiency in wholesale means leveraging your relative scale to save money and increase your margin. And what I mean by relative scale is it doesn't matter whether you're doing wholesale on 1 acre or 10 acres, but you're going to leverage that to, again, be doing kind of trying to make more money off of less work is generally what we're going for. By definition, wholesale is going to be higher risk than going to other markets. Because again, if you only have 5 crops and you have a crop failure on one of them, that's a large portion of what you're growing on your farm now. It can be very hard to get good crop insurance and things like that that would cover you. So it's important that you understand too what your own risk tolerance is, which will just be different for everybody. For me, when I was farming, I wasn't married, I didn't have kids, so I felt like I could take more risks because it was just on my behalf. Your situation might be completely different, and that's totally fine, but it's important you understand your situation before you decide which model to kind of choose. Okay, so we've got 3 types of wholesale. So, and this is obviously a very broad way of putting it, but small scale wholesale is mostly selling to restaurants, like some of the folks that we had on the call last weekend. Medium scale wholesale means selling to large restaurants, co-ops, small food service companies, and large scale means selling to places like food distribution centers and supermarket chains. And it's important we make this differentiation because there's very different skill sets and very different things that go into which type of wholesale you might choose to sell into. So before you choose your model, I do think it's important. I know everybody's at an incubator stage now, but I think it's really important that we think forward in 5 years, like what model is going to work best for us as we grow our farms. So I think the first big picture question that we sometimes pass over, but is so important, is what do you enjoy the most about farming, right? If you're the type of farmer that is sitting here and saying, the best part about farming is I never have to fill out any paperwork, then selling to supermarkets where they're going to make you fill out all sorts of food safety information and invoices all day, it's probably not something you're going to enjoy, and that's totally fine. That's good to know ahead of time. The second one is if you are certified organic, which I know everybody at Big River is. Generally, if you're thinking about getting your own land and maybe not being certified organic, it can be very hard to sell outside of that small scale wholesale, because if you go into the average supermarket or co-op, they want to be able to say everything is certified organic. And so generally you have more markets available to you at a better price if you're willing to get certified. The next question is just how much land and infrastructure and labor you have. If you only have 1 acre of land available to you, it probably doesn't make any sense to try to sell to supermarkets because you'll never have enough, produce to be able to fill their demand. Or by the same token, if say you don't like the idea of having employees and you don't have any kids, you're going to be limited to how much you can grow. But on the other side, if you're maybe saying, yeah, I would love to be able to employ 10 people someday, that might mean that it's a good idea to go for a much larger scale. Again, we talked about the paperwork. We'll get into it more, but I can't stress enough that as your farm gets bigger and bigger and you start selling to bigger and bigger wholesale accounts, you're going to need to do more paperwork and more bureaucracy. And by that, I mean, there's just going to be more people you need to talk to about everything. So again, some people on this call might be really good at that and might not mind that. I personally never cared too much about doing that, but other people, it might just be a deal breaker. How many crops do you want to grow? What is your ability for grading produce? So by that, I mean, when you harvest cucumbers out of the field, would you be okay throwing 30% of them in the compost pile because they're not technically the right shape and size to go into a co-op or a supermarket? And like we said before, what's your risk tolerance? And that's not just what you think your risk tolerance is, but also what your personal situation is. You might have more money in the bank and be okay taking on more risk, or you might have a lot of debt and say, hey, there's no chance I want to take on more risk because I need to be able to pay my bills. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just what works for you. Okay, so small scale agriculture or small scale wholesale accounts. So this model consists almost entirely of restaurants of a small to medium size. These will be the best option if you're used to selling into a CSA or a farmer's market, because they're going to require the largest diversity of produce from you. Because again, they're small enough, they're not going to be buying from a lot of farmers. So you need to be able to show up with the majority of what they need. And they're generally going to put in pretty small orders. And by that, what I mean is somewhere between $150 and $400 per order. You can certainly find restaurants will buy less than $150. But I would recommend that you really push to at least deliver that much to make it worth your time and to value how much time and energy it takes to not only pick the produce, but deliver it and then build a restaurant and be able to get paid and all that type of stuff. Quality is really important, but grading is not. So the difference is quality is how good something actually is. So you might say with a tomato, every farmer knows you can get a great heirloom tomato that's just big, but has a lot of scars on it. That's of good quality, but it's not well graded, because grading basically means how pretty does it look. And so in a restaurant, because everything's getting chopped up, It's totally fine to have stuff if it's of good quality, but it's not graded well. But as you go to these larger accounts, as we'll talk about in a minute, they don't just care how good it is, they care how good it looks as well, which is a whole different thing. So again, but the nice thing is because the restaurants will take things, even if they look a little funny, as long as they're good, that you can sell more of what you harvest. You're not going to be throwing away half the cucumbers because they don't look perfect. So that again has its pluses and minuses. So good news is that these small scale accounts, you're generally not going to have to worry too much about doing paperwork, having food safety certifications, insurances. These tend to be really small businesses just like you are. So they want to know who you are. They might want to come out and see the farm, but you're not going to get buried in paperwork. The downside is they tend to be pretty inconsistent. If anybody's ever worked in a restaurant, you know that the chefs and the staff tend to leave and go other places pretty often. So what that means is you sometimes end up investing a lot of time and energy in somebody who likes you, they like your farm, and then you call one day and they're gone. And that happens all the time. So that's a real downside. Generally, the restaurants will not care if you're certified organic. They're going to care if you're growing organically, but they won't care so much about the certification. And these accounts are going to pay you, a pretty good price for your produce. So a good way to think about it is go into a supermarket and assume you get paid 50 to 70% of what the supermarket is charging for that produce. So meaning if you go in and you say, okay, cucumbers are $1.50 a pound, organic cucumbers are $1.50 a pound, that means you'll probably get between 75 cents and $1 when you sell those cucumbers to the restaurant. Okay. Medium scale, that consists largely of food co-ops, larger restaurants, smaller food service companies, people that do processing. The advantage of this is now all of a sudden you don't need to grow so many different types of produce because you're just going to be their cucumber person, right? And then you can bring in 200 pounds of cucumbers. They're never going to ask, oh, could you bring in some fennel on the side? They'll need a large quantity of whatever you grow. So generally places like this will be looking for something like, say, 200 pounds of cucumbers at one time. Orders will generally be more than $500 per delivery. And then the flip side is, though, these places are really used to dealing with very professional businesses. So that means if you show up with a truck, it's going to have to be a refrigerated truck. It means if you give them an invoice, it can't just be on the back of a piece of paper. It's got to be a formal one that an accountant can deal with. Those are growing pains we all go through. I learned the hard way with a lot of these places how to do it. But it's important to know that once you move over to that world, they're not going to have much empathy for the fact that you're a farmer. They're going to want you to just act like everybody else does when they show up and drop things off on clean pallets, have the right invoices, all that type of stuff. Some of these accounts will require you to carry extra insurance or have like a GAP food safety certification. The good news is that these accounts tend to be very consistent because at a food co-op, so for a restaurant, for example, the person buying your produce is the chef. At a food co-op, it'll be the produce buyer. And that tends to be the type of job people stick in for a very long time. Like when I was selling to the Lake Winds co-ops, I worked with the exact same people for all 6 years I was selling to. So what that means is as you're building a relationship, you get to keep working with the same people. You don't have to keep reselling the idea of buying from you to a new person every time. Grading becomes very, very important for these accounts. So you'll notice, for example, if you go into a food co-op, every zucchini is almost exactly the same size and none of them have blemishes and they're all the same color. So again, grading is really about how pretty it is, but that becomes very, very important for these accounts. And that means that you're going to end up throwing away more produce or needing to find another way to sell that produce. Because we all know, for example, when you pick zucchini, for every 5 zucchini you pick, one of them is going to have a blemish or a mark on it or be a funny shape. And those just can't be sold to these types of accounts because the idea is they're putting them out on the shelf for the customers to actually buy. And again, these accounts will require you to be certified organic because that's what their customers are asking for. And that's the only way they can pay you a good price and charge their customers a good price. Okay, so the last one is large scale wholesale. And when I say large, I think it's important to know that doesn't mean you have to be able to service these on your own. Sometimes you may be able to work with large scale accounts through a place like the Good Acre, or I would even consider a place like Big Rivers Collaborative CSA to essentially be a wholesale account for all of the farmers because you're all selling in and then that's a way that you can distribute the produce. So these accounts will want the least variety, but the most quantity. So for example, one distributor I sold to, they only bought 10 crops from me, but they buy over 1,000 pounds of cucumbers every week. These orders get really big. It's, $2,000 to $5,000 of produce in the truck at a time is not unusual. And even more so than before, this is where everything needs to be super professional. So you've got to have the refrigerated truck. You've got to have things on pallets and wrapped. All the boxes need to have a sticker on them that have lot numbers. Because again, these are really big warehouses that are used to things coming in a certain way. And they'll work with you if you can fit into their stream. But they're not going to make just a whole new process just to be able to buy stuff from you. So these tend to be not the place people start. When I was farming, I didn't work with any of these types of accounts until I was maybe 4 or 5 years in. That's not to say that you can't, but it's to say that there's a lot of skills you need to build up to be able to work with these types of operations. Again, the grading is very, very strict. They're all going to require food safety requirements, insurance. They're going to make you fill out a bunch of paperwork before you can sell to them. And I don't mean that to scare you away. That's just the reality of how these places work. And they're going to pay you the lowest price because they're buying the most quantity. So instead of that 50 to 70% of retail that restaurants might pay, these folks will pay closer to 30% of retail. So again, you're being helped by the fact that they're willing to buy, say, 1,000 pounds of cucumbers at the same time. You save a lot of money when you do that because you don't have to deliver to multiple places. You always know you have a home for those crops. But then in return, the wholesale warehouse is going to say, we can only pay you a pretty low price. I would really encourage everybody, if you start working with these accounts, always make sure that the price you're getting is something you can actually make money off of. Because it's really easy to get big eyes and go, oh my gosh, 1,000 pounds of cucumbers, that sounds great. But then you don't think about whether the price can actually pay your bills. And it never makes any sense to sell produce if you're just losing money on it every time you make that sale. So I thought I'd just give you all an idea of how my farm evolved from year one. The first year I was doing wholesale, my whole farm was grossing, not profiting. Grossing means that the total amount of money people just paid for my produce was about $40,000. And 100% of that went to these small scale restaurants. But that was an enormous amount of work. I mean, that was me stopping at 15, 20 restaurants every week, trying to figure out what the chefs want. Then the chefs disappear. Then you got to meet a new chef. So what I tried to do is slowly shift away from small scale to these larger scale places. And what you can see is it didn't happen overnight, but over the course of 5 years, I was able to switch to these larger scale places as I was growing my farm, right? So by the time I was done, we were doing about $400,000 gross in produce. But the reason we were able to do that is because $120,000 was all going to one customer, right? I just had to load the truck. You just drove 45 minutes down the road, you dropped it off and you're done. I got paid less for the produce, but it saved me so much time. I never could have done that if I was trying to service 100 restaurants to make $380,000 off of. And the other reason I want to put this out there is, I'm presenting my story right now, but you all are going to hear my story after I did this for 10 years. So I don't think you should have the expectation or feel like you're behind because you're not ready to sell to a giant co-op grocery chain right now. But we all have to work up towards it. Okay, so I feel like one thing that's really important that often gets missed in this conversation is to figure out what you want, right? Like what you're going to be happy doing, what gives you quality of life. And so all of you are farmers, all of you have been doing this. Sometimes I spend more time on this with really beginning farmers, but I just want to go through it quick because I think it matters even if you're not, which is to figure out like what model works best for you. You need to figure out what you want out of your farm. So always keep in mind that just because you can make something technically work doesn't mean it'll fulfill your goals or be something you actually want to do. So I'd encourage you to really think about your personal goals. How much income do you need to make? Would you want to work on the weekends or not? Are you comfortable doing evening work? Because that'll kind of dictate which types of accounts you can go to. Oh, I saw somebody said that was your gross income. What was my profit? That's a great question. That's always the best question. My profit that last year, so my profit margin varied a lot. By the time I was in year 5, my profit margin was somewhere around 15%, meaning I was profiting $50,000 to $60,000 off of the $380,000 of gross. As anybody whose farm knows, those numbers get a little tough to calculate because, for example, I was living in the same house that my employees were living in. So it's like part of that's a farm expense, part of that's a personal expense. It gets hard to kind of delineate which is which. But I do want to call it that's such a great question because one of my farm mentors used to tell me, if you gross $1 million, but your margin is 0%, you have made $0, right? It doesn't matter how much produce you can sell if there's no profit there, because then there's no money to take home. So it's really, really important to think through. And then the other question I said is my acreage in year 5 was about 13 acres. And I think you absolutely could do the same amount of sales on less acres if you were growing different types of crops. But I had some crops, for example, where, what's an example? Like, for example, Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts, you can make a lot of money per acre because it's a really high value crop. It stays in the ground all year. But I also grew a lot of butternut winter squash. And because the way winter squash grows, you don't make much money per acre. So if you need to make more money on less acreage, I'd encourage you to think more about crops like herbs and lettuces and things like that, and less about these crops like winter squash that take up a lot of room without making too much money.
Thank you. I have one question. So in year 1,
Yeah.
what was the acreage?
So year 1, I technically was growing on an acre, but it turns out an acre is a lot of ground for one person. So it was about 3/4 of an acre that I was growing. Oh no, I'm sorry, year 1. I was thinking of the year I was incubating, which I did not include. The year where I made $40,000, it was about 2.5 acres. That's what I was growing on.
Okay, so before that, how many years were you in the incubator program?
I was only in the incubator program for 1 year. So my background was I trained on farms for 4 years, and then I did the incubator for 1 year, and then I moved on to I rented land for a couple of years, and then I found a farm to buy, and then I bought a farm. But I did a lot of training before I kind of went to the incubator.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. All right. So, and I just want to give one more example of your goals don't need to be financial. I really enjoyed growing Brussels sprouts because nobody else was really doing them in my area. So it's like one of my goals was to be the best Brussels sprout grower. You may have goals related to just being able to feed your community or grow crops that are not available in your community. Those are all valid. So I don't want to make it all about money here. All right. So we just talked about it in a second, but I just want to bring this up again, how important it is to think about your profit as opposed to your gross. So in the end of the day, there's a lot of writing here, but profit is the amount of money you take home after you've taken out all of the taxes, all of your expenses and everything else. And it's important to remember you're paying taxes too, because sometimes people think they're going to make more money and then they have to pay the taxes on it. So I'm sure there are plenty of people at Big River that can help you with the budgeting and all of that. Happy to talk about this more later if there's questions. Okay, so this is a really important thing that I like to talk about with farmers. I don't have a catchy way to say it, but I call it the limiting and advantageous factors on your farm. And I think this is the most important thing to think about when figuring out what type of wholesale you want to do or just what your farm model should be. So you really have to write down for yourself, what are my limiting factors? Meaning, do I not have enough acreage? Do I not have people to work on my farm? Do I not have access to getting loans? And then your advantageous factors, which might be, my family has a big farm that I can take over, so I have a lot of acreage. Or I used to work in restaurants, so I know a lot of chefs. Or I know how to grow certain crops that nobody else knows how to grow in the area. But really think clearly about what's going to limit you, what's going to get in your way when you're trying to do this farming, and what will be your advantage that other people don't have. And I think it's extra important too, because like we talked about before, if, for example, you're very limited in the amount of land you have and you don't think you'll be able to get more, you don't want to be growing 2 acres of butternut squash because that'll never pay the bills. You want to grow items that are going to be more intensive as far as the money you can make per acre. So this is like my case study. These are my limiting and advantageous factors. And this is both once I moved to my farm. So I only had 15 acres, which I know might sound a lot to some people, but in the grand scheme of farms, it's not much. So one of the things I had to figure out was, if I want to make this much money, I have to be able to gross at least $30,000 per acre. And to do that, that means like there's certain crops I can grow and there's certain crops I can't grow. So I hate to keep knocking on the butternut squash, right? But that's one of them where it didn't make sense as I kept growing my farm to keep growing the butternut squash because they basically couldn't pay their own way on the acre I had them on. Another limiting factor was I only had enough housing for all my employees would live on my farm. And I only had enough housing for 5 employees. So only 5 people on 15 acres also means I can't do super labor intensive crops like salad greens because there just simply was not enough room to do it. And then, okay, I'll get this real quick. So I had 5 employees. I had 2 employees when I started, my own farm at 2.5 acres. By the time I was done, it was 6 people, including me. And so, yeah, we moved from 2 to 6, but I also started getting a lot more mechanized on my farm as I grew. So we were able to buy more tractors and transplanting equipment and different ways that we were able to kind of speed up the process and make everybody a little more efficient as we were going. I was also very, very lucky that I had a crew my last couple of years that were just excellent. And they were able to harvest and work pretty quick. But one limiting factor for me was only having room to house 5 employees meant I couldn't do things like salad mix where you might need 5 people just on an acre because it's so labor intensive. The advantages I had was, I know this sounds like a weird one, but I don't mind paperwork, unlike most farmers. So I was able to go to places like Whole Foods where they give you just this big booklet you have to fill out. And I imagine most farmers see that and go, I don't want to do this. And I said, well, I get access to this account because I'm willing to do it. So that was a real advantage I had. And then some of the other advantages I had was I had spent time, by the time I got bigger, I'd spent a lot of time growing larger crops like Brussels sprouts, where a lot of people hadn't grown them. And they just had kind of gotten hip and fancy again, so everybody wanted them. So a big advantage I had was I could go to co-ops and go, hey, I know how to grow Brussels sprouts, and nobody else has really quite figured this one out yet. And again, I imagine for many of you, there may be crops that you feel like you have special skills with that others don't. And even if it's something not like Brussels sprouts, like the first time I sold to the Wedge Co-op, I sold them fava beans. I mean, they didn't buy much. It was just like a little tiny container every week, but that was enough to get it so they could know me and let me come in and start to get to know my farm. And then when they had room to buy things like cucumbers, I was first in line because they already knew me. So even if you have something that people don't buy a lot of, that can still be really great as a way to get in to these co-ops or these other accounts because they're always looking for something new that they can't find local. All right, infrastructure. See, I got so many things on my screen here. So because wholesale requires things to be more streamlined, you need to think about your infrastructure. And again, this is going to really differ depending on what type of wholesale you're envisioning. But you really have to think carefully about how you build the infrastructure because you don't want to have to just keep building it over and over again. So thinking really carefully about how big of a walk-in cooler do you need, or a CoolBot cooler. And one of the ways you can figure that out is just figure out the number of square feet, figure out how many boxes can fit in there, and then that basically tells you how much produce you can grow. I think one of the major reasons to take a wholesale approach is because it can help you finance better equipment. Everybody on this call is going to be different. For me, I am not good at fixing tractors. I was born in Philadelphia. I'm a city kid. So being able to buy tractors and equipment that actually works and is newer was a big reason I wanted to go for a model where I could bring more money in, which then meant I could spend more money on my equipment. This also lowers your long-term risk because if you buy a better tractor in the first place, it's, you can sell it for more money when the time comes. And again, this is really just going to be, this could be major for some of you or minor for others. But for me, I would not have been able to make my farm work if the tractors were always breaking down. I have friends, though, that are excellent at tractors, and they purposely buy tractors that are always breaking down because they have a fun time fixing it. So again, it's not right or wrong, but you really have to think carefully about what's going to be a good fit for you. The other thing you have to think about is that, unlike with farmers market, wholesale produce goes through multiple layers before it gets to the end user. So what I mean by that is, when you go to the farmers market, you might, a day or two ahead of time, pick radish bunches, or let's take kale. You'll pick the kale, you bring it to the farmer's market, the person's going to use the kale, buys it, and then takes it home. But when you're selling wholesale, it's now going through a couple extra layers. So as an example, let's say you sell to a food co-op. You pick the kale, then you sold it to the co-op, right? Then the co-op held onto it for a couple of days, sold it to the customer, who now expects that to last a while in their fridge. So the produce quality actually needs to be better for wholesale. And what really matters is post-harvest infrastructure. So, and when I say that, that sounds fancy and expensive, but it doesn't have to be. But it means, for example, if you're harvesting things like kale, you have to be able to cool them down in cold water almost immediately. So it can really get down to a cold temperature and it doesn't go bad just a couple of days later. It means if you have a walk-in cooler, you need one that's maybe not necessarily going to be a cool bot. Cool bots are great. And if people don't know what they are, it's kind of a way you can turn an air conditioner into a walk-in cooler. But the downside is they don't pull out enough warm air quick enough. So it makes the ambient temperature cold, but it doesn't always make the produce cold. So you just really need to think about that fact. And if you start selling to some of these larger places, as an example, I sold zucchini to a wholesale warehouse. So what happened is I would pick zucchini, 4 days later, it would go to the wholesale warehouse. They'd hold on to it for a week. Then it would go to a supermarket. They'd hold on to it for a couple days. Then the customer would buy it. My produce is already like 10 days old at that. So if my produce only lasts 10 days, the customer's going to buy the zucchini and it's going to go bad the next night in their refrigerator. So that's why it's so important to be able to get produce down to the proper temperature and keep it there, which might just look a little different than, again, if you're going to a farmer's market, there's nothing in between you and the customer. Or I think a great example is also like the group CSA. I mean, it's going into the CSA and then the customer gets it and they eat it. As long as it's good for the whole week, they're good to go. I thought I'd just give an example of some of the infrastructure I had. And this is my last year, so don't take this as what you need right now. But I thought I'd give you an example of what it took to do this on that kind of 15-acre scale and what it cost. Because everybody talks about what you need, but they don't want to talk about how much it costs. So I'm also, before we go ahead, I'll talk about what my first year was like too, because I think that's probably even more relevant. But you can see by the time I was doing that big scale farm, you know, I had a brush washer, which is, I don't know, Becca, is there a brush washer at Big River? Maybe not.
Yes.
Oh, okay, there. Oh, cool. Thanks, Becca.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, you've got machines like brush washers where if you've used one before, then you know you can wash cucumbers 10 times as quickly in a brush washer as by hand. So yes, it costs $5,000, but at the scale I was at, it paid for itself in a year. On a smaller scale, my very first year, what that looked like was I bought, for my pack shed, I bought a like one of those pop-up garages with the metal frame from Costco, and it cost $400, and that was my pack shed. And then we just had 2 tubs of water on timers and a walk-in cooler, and that was it. And that was totally fine. So I don't want anybody to think, oh my gosh, I don't have $100,000 for machines. I'm never gonna make this work. So that was totally fine. But as you grow, thinking about getting things like tractors, cultivators, things like that, that are gonna make it so you can be more efficient on your scale is really important. Okay. So marketing, I think, is the hardest thing we all deal with as farmers. If I had $1 for every time a farmer had told me, if all I had to do was grow this and somebody else would just buy it, I'd be totally fine, right? But we're all small business people, and the nature of any small business is you can't just make something, you also have to sell. So I spend a lot of time talking about marketing because I think it's a muscle we need to exercise. And I really want to recognize everybody's going to be coming from a different place with this. But I'm going to try to give some basic tips that I think help a lot when you're marketing your produce. So the first thing is, I think the common misconception is people don't want to market or sell their stuff because something about it feels inauthentic or like you're tricking people. Because what we tend to think of when we think of sales is like a car salesman or somebody knocking on our door to sell us something. But of course, we're not doing that. Every single person that's on this call has something of high value to offer to anybody, which is fresh, nutritious, organic produce. So I think it's first important that we just kind of flip our brains around and we go, what we have to offer is really necessary. This is not something that's unnecessary. It's something that people need. And so we can be authentic to ourselves and our vision and still sell what we're doing. So the key to making any good marketing plan is creating one you feel comfortable and confident with. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I did. but that doesn't mean it's what you should do. Because I think in the end of the day, we're really selling ourselves when we sell our produce, and people will know. If you're walking up and you're just doing, Ariel's pitch, it's not going to work very well. You need to figure out kind of what your voice is and what feels authentic to you. So what I will say is, though, I've always had two key mantras in marketing, and they've helped me honestly to get anything out of this call. This is what I'll insist that we get out of it. So the first one is, if you don't advocate for yourself, no one will. And what I mean by that is, I sold $400,000 worth of produce a year. Not once did somebody come to me and say, I want to buy your produce. It was all me going and advocating for myself and talking to other people and explaining to them why it was important they bought my produce. And so often we'll have opportunities in front of us, but we're kind of hoping somebody will just advocate for us. And it's so important we do it for ourselves. So I'll give you an example. When I went to the Moses conference 6 or 7 years ago, Whole Foods, like the supermarket chain, had a stand set up where they were just advertising to people about Whole Foods. And I'd always thought it would be cool if Whole Foods would buy my stuff. But of course, they were never going to call me. So I actually went up to the stand and I said, I want to sell to you. What will you buy? And the first thing they said is, I don't think we need anything from a farm your scale. And I said, well, what about Brussels sprouts? I'm really good at growing Brussels sprouts. And the guy said, you know what? That's actually pretty interesting. And he called one of the stores and got them to start buying my Brussels sprouts. But the point being, there were like multiple points where that conversation could have just been over, right? By advocating for myself and really believing in myself that I had something valuable to offer was of huge benefit. The second one I pulled from somewhere I used to work, which is don't create customers, create evangelists. This is, if anybody's familiar with Sleep Number mattresses of all places, which is based out of Minneapolis. This is their internal motto, and they're a very successful company. So what that means is a customer is someone who buys your products, right? That's all they do. They buy it, and as long as it works for them. An evangelist is someone who converts other people into also wanting to buy your products. So if you go through and you're able to talk to restaurants, if you're able to talk to co-op people, folks at your farm stand, if you can sell them good enough on your vision of how good your produce is, why you're worth supporting, of your story, they will then do the work for you. They will tell other people, oh my gosh, you have to go get a Big River CSA share. It was so good, right? And so I think it's so important that we encourage our community, our customers, our family to go out there and advocate for us too. So again, the difference for me is evangelists help get other people on board with you as well. So the brief example I'll give is Sleep Number. If you're not familiar, they're a mattress company. They sell very expensive mattresses and they do very little marketing. And the reason is because most of the people that buy the mattress buy it because one of their friends told them it's a good mattress and you should buy it because they trust their friends, right? And so it's the same thing in produce world. If you can get people that trust you and like what you're doing, you can convince them to talk to other people about it the same way you would, you'll be in great shape. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a little bit of kind of verbal and written marketing.
Ariel?
Yeah.
Sorry, before we start, there was a question back on the infrastructure portion about, did you apply for many grants for various infrastructure / equipment? And how many grants did you receive, if any, over the years? And that was a question from Kristen.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Yes. So the 3 grants I received, which I would encourage any of you to look into. One is LOF, which is the Lake Winds Organic Field Fund. That is a grant every year where the Lake Winds co-ops will give up to $8,000 to farms that need money. They say what they need the money for. So it's unrestricted in that sense. I got a small amount of money from them. I received some money from what's called an EQIP grant. So it's EQIP. And that's through the NRCS, which is part of the USDA. And they will basically give people grants to make additions on their farms that'll help the environment. So for many organic farmers, that means that they'll be willing to buy you a high tunnel or greenhouse. It's not guaranteed, but it's a great grant. I got a high tunnel through it. I don't know if I actually got any money from a third one. The majority of the money for my farm came from growing slowly and the farm financing itself. So I didn't start off with any like family money or anything like that. I just kind of started my farm the first year, saved some money so I could buy more and kept going. The majority of the funding on my farm came from the FSA though. So FSA stands for Farm Services Agency. And that's generally where farmers will go to get loans. And you can get a loan for anything from your farm property to, I would get something called an operating loan every year. And that's money to buy things like seed and fertilizer at the start of the year. And then you pay them back at the end of the year. The FSA is generally offers very low interest rates. And they're also like, their whole purpose is to work with farmers because most banks don't like to work with farmers because they're too risky. So the FSA tends to be a lot more understanding. Just so you know, every county has its own FSA office. And so you have to go in and kind of get to know the person that runs that FSA office. We tend to be very lucky in this part of the country that because there are so many organic farms, they kind of know what you're talking about. If you go on, you say, hey, I want to start a vegetable farm. There's other parts of the country where they're only used to just funding people that grow corn and soy, and it can be a lot harder to convince them this is a viable type of operation. But that's where a lot of my money came from, was also getting those loans so I could kind of build my farm ahead of time. The only thing I'll say on that is, again, everybody's got their own needs as far as debt and things like that. But you know, be very careful when you think about how much debt you're willing to take on, because debt can get really out of hand on farms, and you see it all the time. So just be really careful thinking through how much money you're taking out versus how much money you have available to you. And yeah, maybe that's what I'll say, but there's plenty of financial advisors that can help you figure out what's kind of responsible as well. The only other one I want to put out there that I would encourage everybody to look into is the Mill City Farmers Market has a grant. I believe it's called the Next Generation Grant. And just like the Lakewoods grant, you don't have to sell at Mill City to be able to have this grant. And they do the same thing. They will, I believe it's up to $5,000, and you tell them what you need for your farm, and then they'll write out the grant for that. So especially the LOF one, I'd really encourage people to look into, because there's usually a lot of money available. So zooming back over to marketing, the first and most important step in marketing yourself is to figure out what your pitch is. And again, I know this all sounds a little, you know, do I really have to write a marketing pitch? But unfortunately, the answer is yes. So before you make any sales calls, before you visit anybody, oh, sorry, does somebody have something to say? Oh,
Nope, that might have been me. I wasn't on mute. This is Becca.
Okay.
Sorry.
So no matter what you do with these pitch, I think you need to answer a central question, which is, why would someone work with me, right? There's a lot of vegetables in this world. Why are they buying vegetables from you? Your verbal pitch should be no more than 4 sentences, right? So the colloquial way is to say it should be an elevator pitch, meaning can you get it out really quick and tell people what you do, why you stand out, and how you can help other customers. If you can't get out the pitch in less than 30 seconds, that's where you start to sound like a door-to-door salesperson. Because now all of a sudden somebody's just standing there and you're just telling them all these facts. A written pitch should include all the relevant information a customer needs to know about you. I'd really encourage you, just be accurate about what you need. Don't put lower prices than you're willing to take. Don't put crops you don't have. Just really write down exactly the way it is on your farm so people can figure out whether that works for them. And I'll go into details about both of these. Okay, so if I'm going to tell people to do it, I got to do it myself. So this is my pitch, right? This is what I used to use when I called people up. So I'd say, my name is Ariel. I run Seed to Seed Farm. We grow 13 acres of certified organic vegetables entirely for wholesale accounts. We grow a ton of Brussels sprouts for pretty much everybody in the Twin Cities. And I'd love to be able to work with you on them or any other crops you need. And that was it, right? That's the intro piece. Because again, you want to convey something about yourself that people can hang on to. And then tell them again, what's the value equation? Why should you work with me? You should work with me because I grow Brussels sprouts for everybody, right? So when you might notice that I managed to get out, I got my name, my farm name, the fact that I'm certified organic, crops I grow. So again, yours doesn't have to be like this, but something similar where again, you can just get out your core value equation to folks quickly. And I really encourage you to. This is awkward. I know it is. So practice with friends or family. Honestly, it's not. I'm somebody that probably likes doing this more than the average person, and even I find this to be uncomfortable until you get some practice. Okay, so before we go, I do want to say what the written pitch is, which is, I don't remember if I have a slide in here. Your written pitch should really be the same information, and then also have a list of your crops, when they're available, and how much you're selling them for. And you want that because then if you go to a restaurant, you can drop that off and they can look it over. Or if you meet some folks that say, hey, I know somebody, you know, give it to them in written form so they always have that to work off of. All right, record keeping. I know we're going around a little bit, but I'd really encourage you to keep records of your marketing. So you need to remember who you talk to, right? Because otherwise you're going to call, I know you don't think it now, but after you do this for a week, you're going to be like, who did I talk to on Monday? So you really need to keep track of who you talked to and what their responses were, because that way you don't end up calling the same person over and over again, but you also get really valuable information. It's kind of like detective work. So you might call a place and they might say, you might call Big River and they might say, you know, hey, I'm Ariel, like, I don't really know about purchasing, but you got to talk to Becca next time you call, right? And then you can make a note that says Big River Farms, Becca is the person I need to talk to. Now, the next time you call, you can ask for Becca. And you're going to sound like you're way more likely to get a response because now you actually sound like you know who you need to talk to. All right, so this all brings up the question of then, if we can market ourselves, how do we figure out who we're supposed to be calling or selling our stuff to? So your most successful potential markets are always going to be what's called warm leads. And warm leads are people where you have information about them ahead of time. So it might be you have a friend or family member that works there, or they're an acquaintance, or it might even be so much as you just know the name of the person. But it's not just you calling cold and saying, I don't know anything about this place. How can I sell to them? You can also do some simple internet research. I used to spend an hour a day just on Google, just seeing what restaurants say they buy organic food, which co-ops are in my area. You'd be shocked how much you can find just on the internet these days. You don't need to be an expert to get this information. And what we used to do is, me and my employees, is we take an hour a day, we write it all down, and we just make calls and see who we could get in touch with. I'd also really encourage you, pay attention to your community. If you really, everywhere you go, if you look at it as a potential place you could sell produce, you'll be shocked how much you start seeing. So you might start going into the supermarket and noticing, hey, you know, for some reason, all the hot peppers are being imported at the height of the summer. You know, that's an opportunity for you because there's no local farmer for those hot peppers. You might walk into a local restaurant and notice that it seems like everything they're carrying is from a local farmer except mushrooms, and you have mushrooms. So even to this day, I don't do this anymore for my job. I can't help myself. If I go grocery shopping, I just have to take a look at the produce section to see where did everything come from. You know, you can even go further and go, oh yeah, this place does have local peppers, but they look really bad. You know, maybe they're looking for a new farmer to buy them from. So just take note. And I'd also encourage you to, you know, best you can, try to shop where you want to sell, because the more time you spend in those places, the more you can get a feel for what they might be looking for. So if you go shopping at, you know, the Stillwater Co-op was on the call the other day. Even if you can't afford to go shopping there all the time, even if you just go there to get a cup of coffee once a week, you can look around and notice kind of, oh, okay, it seems like even with a store like that, oh, it seems like they have local lettuce all the time, except on Thursdays and Fridays. Maybe there's a gap in their deliveries, and then you can be the person to provide lettuce on Thursdays and Fridays. So like, there's a lot of information to take in. And it depends on who you are, but I find it to be actually pretty fun detective work. You know, you really get to kind of get a feel for these stores and how they operate. Okay, so remember again, you know, when you're identifying these markets, you have to do detective work. You got to advocate for yourself. And the biggest piece of detective work is you cannot settle for the first layer of information. So what I mean by that is, if you call, for this example, if you call Big River Farms and they say, yeah, Becca's not here, sorry, right? You could do that, and then you'll never be able to sell to Big River Farms. But if you're willing to go past that first layer of information and do some more research about who else can I talk to, when's a good time to call to get a hold of Becca, you know, what are they looking for? So often people give up because their first shot didn't work. And by all means, if somebody says, hey, we're not looking for farmers, we don't want to buy from you, totally, you can respect that. But oftentimes it's more that you get somebody on the phone who they're not the person to buy the produce, or you called at the wrong time. Don't let that hinder you. Again, really don't be afraid to be persistent, because again, I really want to encourage everybody, you have something of enormous value to offer. People just need to know that you have it to offer. So again, some of this research you can do, like I said, I used to go to the co-ops and write down who's growing what, and you start noticing, it's like, okay, Driftless Farm does all the carrots in all the co-ops. And, Harmony Valley does all the bagged salad mix in the co-ops. And you start to get a feel for who's doing what, and then also what might be available. Before you make a sales call though, figure out if you can, who does the purchasing and what their name is. This is basic human nature, but having somebody's name ahead of time makes an enormous difference when you're talking to them. So I think this is my next slide is on this, but if you can call ahead of time and get somebody's name, you will find it'll make an enormous difference in whether or not they actually pick up the phone and whether or not they actually like talking to you. Because again, we're human, we all like hearing our name, it feels very personal, and it really works. So again, part of identifying markets is what I call utilizing good luck, right? Every single market I ever found, and I'll tell my story in a second, was due to good luck, but it was because I was also able to recognize when good luck was in front of me. So almost all customer accounts are going to come from a combination of hard work and good luck, which always means being prepared to talk about yourself, and really pitch why you're the farm to buy from. So this is my case study. This is my story. So, which I really love telling because I think it's a great example of why it's important to pay attention to this good luck. So my first year I was growing wholesale. This is when I was growing those 2.5 acres. We had a hailstorm in the spring that damaged my tomato crop, which was a big deal because I was expecting to make 50% of my money off tomatoes that year. So I was selling at a farmer's market, and one of the volunteers there, I know used to be a chef at a restaurant called Lucius, which doesn't exist anymore, but they used to buy a lot of local produce. So I asked Lori, what she could do to help. And she said, well, we can buy some tomatoes and make tomato sauce out of them, but you really should know that the Minneapolis School District, it has a farm to school program that she worked with, and they're interested in buying seconds produce so they can make more fresh produce items for the kids. So within a couple of weeks, she hooked me up with them, and the Minneapolis School District came out, and they bought not only all the tomatoes, but they bought all sorts of other produce that I had too. So then the next year I thought, well, the produce doesn't go straight to the schools. It goes to a wholesale warehouse, and then it goes to the schools. So I called the wholesale warehouse, Russ Davis, and I said, well, you guys are already bringing in my stuff for the schools. You should just buy it for everywhere else too. And much to my surprise, they said yes. This is an advocacy thing. They actually told me I was the first small organic grower locally they'd ever worked with. And when I asked why, they said, because you're the first one that called and asked. So anybody else could have been just as lucky if they called a couple of years before I did. So then the next year, while I was attending a food show put on by Russ Davis, and if you ever been to a food show, it's like, for small farmers, it's a nightmare. It's just like Del Monte Bananas and all the big companies are there, and then you're just with your little farm stand telling people about your farm. But while I was there, the produce buyers from the Lake Winds co-ops were also there, and they met me and they decided they wanted to buy my tomatoes and Brussels sprouts. So all these accounts I just listed added up to, out of those $350,000 to $400,000 a year in sales, that was 250,000 of those sales that all quite literally came because I talked to a farmer's market volunteer about buying some tomatoes for a local restaurant. So I'd really encourage you, again, I mean, this was over the course of years, but really my whole career came out of that conversation. And again, none of that would have happened if I didn't advocate for myself by saying, hey, I've got something of value. So I'd really encourage you, again, never be afraid. The worst thing that happens is somebody says no. They were already a no before you talk to them, and then they're a no afterwards. It's no big deal. All right. So I do think it's important to talk about identifying good customers. This is something I was talking with some of the big river folks about for that call last week. Just because someone can buy your produce doesn't mean you should sell it to them. There are all sorts of wholesale customers out there who may not pay you a fair price. They may not reliably even pay you at all. They might have unrealistic expectations. It's a really big mistake people make is not being willing to turn down accounts. because it's so exciting when somebody wants to buy your produce. I can identify. I mean, the first couple of years, it blew my mind that a restaurant would want to buy my produce and then serve it to their customers. I was so proud of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good idea. So it doesn't matter, how much you gross from a new customer, how prestigious they are. If you're losing money working with them, it's not good for you. So there's a couple ways to figure out if a customer is going to be good to work with. Good customers have to align with your current infrastructure and wholesale program. So what I mean by that is you have to be able to handle what they need. So if a restaurant says, hey, I need you to deliver to me 5 days a week to make this worth it, but you were only going to be in Minneapolis 2 days a week. That doesn't make any sense, right? Now you're going in 3 days a week just for this one restaurant, and you're probably losing money. Good customers have to either be a place that you can be profitable selling to, or they'll become profitable in the near future. Because again, all of us are farmers for reasons that have a lot more than just money. But in the end of the day, you have to be able to pay your bills. So you have to be able to make some profit off of what you're doing. But the most important thing out of all of this is good customers have to be partners with your farm. So this is a really important distinction to me. A customer is only working with you as long as they're making the maximum amount of money, right? So that means if they find produce cheaper somewhere else, they're just going to buy it from the other person because it's just money changing hands. A partner is in a relationship with you and your farm to the benefit of both. So I'll give you an example. If I sold to, I don't know anything about health foods, but you take a conventional grocery store like that. They might buy my Brussels sprouts for as long as I had the cheapest Brussels sprouts available. But then if somebody else comes along and they can get them cheaper and make more money, they'll go with them. But on the other side, if I sold to a place like the Lake Winds Co-op, as an example, when Lake Winds wanted me to grow tomatoes for them, I told them, I think I need more high tunnels to be able to do this so I could grow them inside so they're better quality. Lake Winds said, you know what? We'll loan you the money and you can pay us back in tomatoes for 3 years. And we actually did this, signed a loan document, the whole thing, because they understood that giving up a little money now would help them get a better product later. We were in a relationship. So it didn't always mean that I got the best side of it or they got the best side of it, but it meant we were both working so we could all be successful. And that always made me feel so much more comfort working with them because I knew there was no reality in which they'd let me fail because they'd invested so heavily in me. So I'd really encourage you to look for people that are willing to form a relationship because as a small farmer, that's what you need. You need people who are advocating for you, not just people who are trying to make money off of you. Right. Sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on the questions here too. Okay. Okay, so the next piece is, I don't know if I coined this term or not, but this is the term I use, which is ethical sales. So the number one reason I think farmers say that they don't want to fully engage in marketing or sales of their products is because they don't want to feel like they're bothering someone. They don't want to feel like they're convincing someone to buy something they don't need. So it's really important to distinguish between traditional sales and ethical sales. So traditional sales is where you form a relationship with someone for the explicit purpose of making you money, whether or not the person actually needs the thing you're selling, right? So the classic is you might go to a car dealership and that person's going to probably try to sell you the most expensive car they can, regardless of whether you actually need that car, because their goal is just to make money. Ethical sales is the process of forming a relationship with someone to both of your mutual benefit, and in the process, making both of you money. So again, what we're all doing here, what every farmer is doing is what I call ethical sales. You are doing something that is to the benefit of yourself and the store and the consumer eating your produce. So you can sleep easy at night knowing you're not trying to trick somebody into something. But to be conducting ethical sales, you need to be thinking about a sales relationship in the same way you would any other relationship. So that means you should be willing to give and take to make the relationship mutual and successful. So an example would be, when I sold to that Lake Winds Co-op, sometimes they would ask me to come in the morning and give a talk to their staff about vegetable farming. Now that doesn't make me money, but we're in a relationship. They help me out. They help me with my high tunnels. They help me buying my produce. So I'm willing to go and then help them out in return. So I really encourage you to think about these relationships in the same way as you would think about a friendship or a family member or a community member, and that it has to be give and take. And by definition, if you're doing ethical sales, you never have to lie, exaggerate, or pressure people. which is, I think, what we all kind of worry about, that's what it's going to feel like if we're selling people stuff. But the reality is it doesn't have to be at all. All right, so we're going to get really into the nitty gritty, but believe it or not, this stuff really makes a big difference. So a lot of the type of sales we're going to do when we start our farms is cold calling. And what that means is we're approaching people who may not know about us before. So we don't know a person who works there. We just literally need to go in cold and convince them they should buy something from us. And this is 100% of the sales I did for my first 3 years, was just walking into restaurants, calling restaurants, walking into places and seeing. So it's more art than science, but there's a lot of stuff you actually can do that'll make it successful. So the first is you're going to get turned down a lot, and that's fine, totally fine. You know, if 20% of people you call want to actually buy your stuff, you're doing great. So don't get bogged down by making a bunch of calls and never hearing back. That's totally normal. You never want to be rude or pushy. If someone's uninterested, you just say thank you and you can move on. Customers know what's right for them. So sometimes it's frustrating. You think you found the perfect spot and they're just not interested. So it's great. It's okay. You can just move on. Couple really specific things that matter. Never leave a message. People never call back if you leave them a message. So it's always better to just say, when would be a good time to call back, and call back then. Because if you left a message, then it gets weird to call back. But I think it's always better to just try to get somebody live on the line. Keep in mind the purpose of your call. So if you call somebody, the purpose isn't to get them to buy your stuff, because nobody's just going to buy your vegetables from a phone call. It's to convince them to have an in-person meeting with you. So what I used to do is you'd make the calls, and this is like June is a great time for this, June, early July. You make the calls, and that's not the time to go through, here's how many days I deliver, here's all the crops I have. It would just be, hey, you know, I give my verbal pitch like the one I gave before, and then the next question would be, could I swing by with some produce and we could talk? And I'd set it up so in a day I might have 3 or 4 restaurants. I'd bring them a little bit of produce, because again, what people are buying is you as well, right? They don't want it to be anonymous. They want to meet you. They want to attach a face to the produce. So I think that's really important. Try to do your research before you call. You know, again, if you can kind of know the names of the stores, the stuff they buy, that type of stuff. This is some very specific information, but Tuesdays through Thursdays, 1 to 3 p.m. for restaurants is a great time to call, because that's when they're least busy. That's before their shift starts for like a big dinner rush. If you call it like 6 p.m., nobody's going to pick up because they're so busy. For produce buyers, if you call at 10 in the morning, they're all in normally, but they haven't started the busy stretch yet. So it's a really good time to get a hold of them. It's always better to call first than just stop in. I once got literally shoved out of a pizza restaurant for stopping in uninvited. So it's good to call first. You don't want people to like feel like they've got you in their space without having asked for it. Okay, but here's the real secret. If I were to give it the secret sauce. So the most important piece of a cold call is not talking to the buyer, right? Because if you get a hold of the buyer, meaning the chef, the produce manager, those are generally people who like vegetables. They like produce. That's why they're in this. They probably want to talk with you. But getting on the phone with the chef or the buyer is the hard part, because as we all know, when you call, like if you call a doctor's office, the doctor doesn't pick up. Somebody else picks up to figure out whether or not it's worth the doctor's time to talk to you. So 90% of the time you call, you're going to get what's called the gatekeeper. And a gatekeeper is literally what it sounds like. It's a person who's trying to determine, is it worth bothering my boss, essentially, with whatever you're calling? So this can be a secretary, office manager, host, whatever it is, but they're filtering calls. So the first thing you can do is know what you're going to say before you call, because you can get really easily flustered if you call and then you think it was going to be the chef, but it's actually the front of house person. So this is what I was talking about before, and I know it sounds silly, but I promise you it works. People like hearing their name. If you repeat the gatekeeper's name back to them, I promise your success rate goes up 100%. So meaning if you call me and I say, hey, this is Ariel, you know, welcome to my restaurant, what can I do for you? Merely replying with, oh, hi, Ariel, could you put me through to the chef? You're far more likely to be successful than if you don't include the person's name. So try to speak as definitively as possible. So again, you don't want to do what I just did, which is say hoping, right? If you're saying, oh, I'm hoping, or I'm wondering, or could you, you know, if you talk in definitive words, people tend to think, okay, this is a person who needs to get through to the chef. And again, if you can't get through, don't leave a message. Just get the name of the person, get the name of the chef, when to call back, and just try again. you'd be shocked. Again, I know it sounds silly, but like this stuff really, really makes a difference in how people respond to you. And it's really easy to implement in a way that I think will really help. I'd also encourage people too to say that sending emails are, like, especially if English is not your first language, like sending things like letters or emails is totally fine too. I think that can work. That can work great. I want to recognize this might be a different situation for different folks. And the other thing too is you can have folks that, you know, may be willing to call in on your behalf, or if you know people who are customers at a restaurant, that makes a big difference. If you have a friend that say eats somewhere, if they, when they get their meal, say, hey, it would be so great if you could buy, you know, your produce from Big River Farms, that really makes a difference. Okay, so once you get to the buyer, like we talked about, you got that marketing pitch, it's together. The best thing you can do is, it's not like people are going to hang up on you, but just always assume your next sentence will be your last, right? Meaning get out the most important information first, because if you wait until, you know, sentence 12 to say that you're an organic farmer at Big River Farms, somebody might have already tuned out and they're not paying attention anymore. So I think it's really important to be able to get into what you need first. And again, the point of the cold call is not to get a new customer on board, it's to get an in-person meeting. And the last thing I'll say again is, because I'll keep saying it, you know, be firm and advocate for yourself. You know, don't be afraid. If you call up that chef, don't be afraid to say, I have excellent tasting produce, you know, and you really need to try it. Because it's true. I know that's true, you know, without even having bought from any of you. The nature of what you're offering, anybody who goes to a conventional supermarket and tries to buy some of that produce, you know how much better your produce is. So I think it's, again, you're barely selling people because you're kind of giving them something they just didn't know they needed yet. Okay, so the flip side of a cold call is a warm call. And that's where we talked about you already know somebody. So you'll always be more successful if you know somebody. But sometimes you'll just have warm information. Like I said, it might just be the name of the chef. It might be, you know, another farm they work with. It might be a friend of yours knows their restaurant. Whatever it is, try to drop that information. Because imagine this was you, right? If somebody calls you and says, hey, I need your help, you may or may not help them. But if somebody calls you and says, hey, I'm friends with your best friend, could you help me out? They're going to be far more likely, you're going to be far more likely to help that person because you have a mutual connection. Okay, I'm going to take a quick breather here to see if anybody has questions, or I know I'm going quickly. So does anybody have questions or anything else they want me to kind of hit on with those topics? Perfect. Okay, cool. Well, feel free to keep typing them in the chat if you do. So I know that, I think Natalie's going to talk more about crop selection and varieties in a future talk. So I'll go through this, but maybe I won't, just so I don't double up too much.
Yeah, Natalie will be teaching a class on crop planning for a specific market. So yes, a little bit about crop selection in that course as well. So that's going to be a little bit later in March. March 27th will be that class.
Great. So I'll just focus on a really specific part of crop selection then, so we don't kind of double up on what we're already getting into. One thing that's really important to know is that when you're doing wholesale production, you're going to need to grow different types of varieties than you might be growing for a farmer's market or a CSA. And the reason is because of that grading. It doesn't just matter if it's good produce, it matters how it looks. So, okay, we can go into this in a second. But for example, I'm going to try to find my slide here. Stick with me. So this is an example of varieties I used to grow. So for example, I used to grow a bell pepper called Ace, which I don't know, some of you may have grown. It's wonderful, but they all look kind of funny. Like they're not those like big round, you know, peppers. So I had to grow a new variety called Red Knight, which was more appropriate for wholesale markets. Or I used to grow a winter squash variety called Waltham, which some of you might be familiar with. It's great, but it's like a 10-pound winter squash. It's not the type you buy in a supermarket. So I had to switch varieties to a one called JWS, which was 2 to 4 pounds. So again, just to say, I don't want to double up on what we'll talk about with Natalie, but it is really important to make sure you know what you're growing and make sure that it actually fits your market and what they need. Okay, so the only other thing I'll say here is be careful with what you're growing with specialty varieties versus what I'd call kind of mainstream varieties, or, I don't like the word mainstream, but basically what we're doing is we're thinking about how much people buy of these different crops. So for example, something that might be a specialty variety would be something like those fava beans. Fava beans can be great because nobody else is growing them. The market's all to yourself. But keep in mind that a store is never going to go through more than 10 pounds of fava beans in a week. And there's a lot of crops like that that can serve a really important purpose of getting you into a new account or making a name for yourself. I think like one great example is there's a farm called Sogan Valley in southern Minnesota, and they grow a lot of hot peppers, which is pretty unusual for farms out here. And that's how they've made the name for themselves, is they're the hot pepper people. But then they get to sell all the other stuff because people know who they are. So I just really encourage you to do the specialty crops, but understand the role they play in your system. And the role they're going to play in your system isn't going to be so much to immediately make you money as it's going to be to help you get into stores and to help get people more familiar with you and what you're doing. All right. The last piece I'll say on crop selection, it's really important that you understand the pricing structure for crops that you want to sell. So for example, bulk carrots are very hard to make money off of because so many big farms do them that the price is so low that even if you get paid more for them than the big farms, you're still not getting paid enough to make a living. So I think it's really important to think through how much money you can make off crops, what your competition is, and even what the food trends are. So an example for me would be when I first started farming, everybody was juicing. That was what everybody wanted to do. And so I sold a lot of kale because people would make juice out of it. Over the 6 years between then and when I stopped, my kale sales went down by 75% because people stopped juicing, it wasn't cool anymore. But at the same time, my zucchini sales went up 300% because people started wanting to make the like spiralizing them and make them into noodles and things like that. So it seems silly, but it really matters in what people buy. And it made a huge difference with what I could grow. Because you got to remember, if somebody goes to a co-op and they're juicing, they're buying like 10 bunches of kale. That's a big portion of what you're selling. So even if you don't subscribe to these food trends, I think you keeping track of what other people are doing is really important. And that's where you can just walk through the co-op or the supermarket and just see, what's being made out of these things. I remember the first time I was in a Whole Foods and I saw they were selling zoodles, which are the zucchini noodles. I was like, oh man, this is going to be a thing now, and then it's like, okay, that's good warning that the tides are shifting a little bit. There's also trends that never work out. Has anybody seen kalettes? Does anyone know what those are? That makes sense. Kalettes were cool for like 1 year, and it's a cross between kale and Brussels sprouts. So it's like a little tiny kale plant that looks like a Brussels sprout. And I grew those because I was like, they're going to be so hip, they're going to be so cool. And they were like boom and bust all in 1 year. So also be careful about when stuff like that comes along. Every year there's one crop where everybody's going, oh, well, this will be the big thing now. But just keep in mind, things shift slowly. All right, I'm going to skip through some of this because I'm sure Natalie's going to get to it. Okay, so a couple more things I'll hit, and then I'm happy to talk about whatever folks want. When you have sales meetings, you should really come prepared with all the information you need. So again, that would be like that written version of the pitch. So writing down ahead of time what crops you have, what prices you're going to charge, how much of them you think you'll have, and when they'll be available. And it sounds like you all have great resources at Big River to figure out kind of what you think your production will be and when you think you'll have it and all that. But keep in mind, most of the people you work with, even if they work with produce all day, they're not farmers. They have no idea. They're going to ask if you can bring them tomatoes in December. So you really need to lay it out for them. And again, I'd really encourage you, pick the price that's fair for you. Don't go in saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to get paid for this or anything like that, but really go in and say, this is the price that I need. What I found more often than not, it's not that everybody will pay you whatever you want, but folks that really believe in you and believe in your mission, they are willing to pay more to make sure that you can kind of have what you need. So I'd really encourage you all to kind of do that work ahead of time. All right. All right. I don't know that we need to talk about contracts in depth, although I'm happy to if, if folks want to talk about it. Sorry, stick with me while we go through. I think this is all information that honestly Big River does a great job of providing you all with. So, okay, we will go to this piece though. So one thing we talked about was forming these real relationships with your customers. You know, like I said before, I think as small scale farmers, we can't really afford to not have real relationships with customers. So again, I encourage you, think about this relationship as any other one you would in your life. If you need any proof of that, I'm still friends with many of the people I sold produce to, and I haven't sold them produce in 3 or 4 years because I'm not farming anymore. But these are people I formed real relationships with, and they care about me and I care about them. I really encourage you, when you start farming, you may need to take on some relationships with people you're not so thrilled about. That's fine. But think about your plan. Think about how you can slowly work those people out so you can be a happy, you know, profitable person. But I'd also encourage you, spend time to form real relationships with these folks. Put in some extra time so you can just stop off where you drop off the produce and talk to people. If nothing else, you're going to be spending a lot of time with these people, and it's rewarding having real relationships with the people you spend time with. I can think I've got a friend who runs Northern Fires Pizza. If you ever go to the Mill City Farmers Market, he sells pizza there. And, you know, I haven't been farming in 3 or 4 years, but we still hang out sometimes and we still talk shop. And I'm going to help him put a little garden on top of the roof of his restaurant. You know, those are relationships that are impactful and meaningful. So I'd really encourage you, again, keep in mind, there's a lot of cucumbers and peppers and tomatoes in the world. The difference is you're the one that has those cucumbers, tomatoes, and peppers. So you need to really be able to, yeah, make yourself part of the equation. All right, so I think I already talked about the high tunnel that I paid for with tomatoes from Lake Winds. But what I would say is that relationship paid off in so many other ways. One thing that I really like growing was celery. And normally in this part of the country, all the celery comes from California. And because I had this long-term kind of trusting relationship with folks, I said, I'm going to grow the celery. And what I need you to do is not carry the California celery. It has to completely leave the shelf. So the only option is to buy my stuff. And because I had these relationships, they were willing to do that. And they're actually willing to talk to customers one-on-one about, this is why Ariel celery is better than what we used to get. And this is why it's a little more expensive and it looks a little different, but this is why you should buy it. It's night and day. I mean, the Lake Winds co-ops, by the time I was done, were buying literally 1,000 pounds of celery a week. Nowhere else was buying any of it because they weren't willing to put their shoulder into kind of that relationship building. So it's really priceless. And again, just doing it for the long term. This all, you know, like for example, I always give this example, but anytime you send, if you don't treat these relationships in the long term, then you really start missing out. So for example, let's say you've got $200 worth of produce. You go, this produce is not really good, you know, but I'm going to send it out anyways because I need $200. Well, then if you lose that account, think about how much money you're losing over the next couple of years when they don't buy from you anymore. It always makes sense to keep up your end of the bargain and give people high quality stuff that you feel good about. So I always say, always err on the side of too much quality control as opposed to too little, because you really need people to trust you and to trust what you're bringing to the table. And that's it. So I am happy to talk more about any topics, answer specific questions, whatever folks want or whatever will be helpful. And I'll also say too, I will provide a copy of this slideshow to Becca, and then if anybody wants to read over it more in their own time, because I know I sped through a lot, happy to have that too.
Ariel, I had a question because, you know, when you were talking about the wholesale accounts, you said you were growing certain kind of vegetables and then you had to change to meet the requirements of the wholesale. But in your personal opinion, which one tasted better, the varieties that you were growing or the ones that was required by the wholesale account?
That's a great question. It's a really great question. So you're very right that a lot of those more kind of heirloom varieties, they've been bred for taste instead of how they look, which is why they taste so good. I was able to find that I could find what I felt like was a fair compromise. So for example, with like heirloom tomatoes, I love heirloom tomatoes. I used to grow 50 different types of them. There's certain tomatoes that just don't work for wholesale, like Black Krim is an example where it's a really soft, kind of squishy tomato. So it doesn't do well if you pack it and then you ship it and all that type of stuff. But I was able to find heirloom varieties like Brandywine and Cherokee Purple were two of them that tasted really good, but also held up. So yeah, I'm not gonna lie, you may in some ways feel like you need to sacrifice a small amount of taste. But I think what I found over the years of experimenting with different varieties was, it was still night and day compared to like the stuff coming in on a truck from California. I mean, it was still really, really good. But yeah, I mean, the other option is though, if you're somebody that's just a diehard about the flavor, I want to just have the best tasting produce, it makes more sense to work with places like restaurants, because they won't care how it looks, because they're just going to chop it up and make a dish out of it. And that might be a great market for a lot of the more kind of like heirloom or specialty varieties. It's harder with the stores because, like, a little thing you wouldn't think of, for example, like with cucumbers, when you go and you notice they always have them stacked like 5 or 6 high. And if the cucumbers aren't a certain type of cucumber, where they're not all the same size, they can't stack, and it seems so silly to grow something based off of that, but it's real. They don't have any way to do it. So, but that being said, maybe if you wanted, I used to grow, what were they called? Sour gherkin cucumbers, which are like this really fun kind of, yeah, exactly. But like you could never sell those in a store, but I grow them for the farmer's market, and that was a great outlet for me to kind of get to do my more fun stuff.
So in the farmers market, you got a better response with, the non-traditional varieties?
Yeah, especially because if you have varieties that you can sample, then it works great. And I think also when you've got something that's non-traditional, people, it sounds strange, but they want a human being to trust. So like, they want to buy it from you, being able to explain to them, hey, like, this is the non-traditional variety I grow, and this is why it's so good. And then they'll buy it. But if it's just sitting in a store, they're going to go, I don't know, that looks different than the cucumber I'm used to. So like an example for me was, I don't know if you've ever seen Carmen peppers, which it's an Italian frying pepper. So it's a sweet pepper. It's a really good sweet pepper, but it looks almost like a hot pepper. It's like a little more elongated and narrow. I could never sell those in the co-op because, God bless them, but we're in Minnesota and nobody wants spicy food. And they were afraid that those peppers were spicy. But at my farm stand, I could tell people, I say, not only is this not spicy and it's really good, I could just cut you off a piece right now and you can try it. And that was more than enough to get people to try, the more kind of unusual varieties.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you don't have, you mentioned in that that your crops needs to be consistency in size and shape, and also maybe the grading of it. If you don't have enough land to do kind of like crop rotation or land rotation where you need to keep the soil rich to produce that, how do you go about doing that so that you can maintain that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. I think it's less about the rotation for me of the crops and more about what varieties you're growing, but also what you pick out of what's being harvested. So like even on my farm where we had all the room and everything, we'd end up taking about 50% of the cucumbers and they couldn't go to retail because just, I don't care how good your soil is. Everybody knows, you just get a lot of cucumbers that are funny shapes or they're slightly bent or they have a ding. So the important part for me was to find markets for those so that I wasn't losing money. So like with cucumbers, for example, I'd sell all the really good looking ones to the co-ops. And then I actually found a juice shop that would buy the rest of them from me because they didn't care because they're just sliced and they were thrilled to get a bit of a better price. And I used to do that with like tomatoes. There's a, I don't know if they're still there, but there's like Broder's. There's 3 Italian restaurants in the Linden Hills neighborhood. And I would always sell them my seconds tomatoes because they were just making sauce out of them. So they didn't care. So I think it was less about the rotation and more about just trying to find markets for both paths that the produce can take so you can still make money off of both sections of it.
Okay.
Ariel, any different varieties of tomatoes?
What did you say?
Did you grow many different varieties of tomatoes?
So when I first started, my whole gimmick for my farm was, I'm just the tomato guy I'm going to grow because I love tomatoes. So I grew like 60 different types. But that's when I was selling at a farmer's market. And as I went up to the wholesale accounts, I ended up with more like 10 types of tomatoes. Because what you see is when you sell tomatoes to wholesale, people want like the rainbow of colors. So it's like, okay, you need one orange tomato, one pink tomato, one purple tomato, one green tomato. And then you can kind of mix them all together. Then when they have the displays, there's all sorts of color there. So I'd work with about 10 varieties, but really tried to narrow down to the ones that grew well for me, but also looked and tasted good.
So out of the 60 varieties, which varieties were the most tart ones? Because the whole Indian population in Minnesota, like none of them like Roma or the standard ones that are sold. So we keep trying different varieties, and we still haven't found the perfect one.
And so you were saying ones that are like more acidic and tart?
Yes, because our cooking is such that we use a lot of tomatoes and we like it tart.
That's a good question. So the two that immediately come to mind, the brandy wines tend to be a little more acidic. The green zebra tomatoes are actually really tart. And those are like the ones that are ripe when they're green, and they're kind of like, they're tiny and they get kind of like orange stripes on them. And those are really good, and they're really easy to grow too.
How do you spell that?
Oh, it's green, Green, and then zebra, Zebra.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm gonna brainstorm a little bit because I'm sure there's other really good tart varieties of tomatoes that people would like.
Thank you.
But I think that's a great example, though, what you just brought up of like finding a market, right? I mean, you've identified the fact that everybody's growing Roma tomatoes around here, and there is a certain section of people that lives around here that doesn't want those. And so being able to grow for that market, like that's a great example of going through that whole process to figure out a market for yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I have a question, because you mentioned that Lakewood gave you money for, they gave a grant, they gave a loan for the tunnels. But then when they gave you the loan for the high tunnels, did you own your own?
Yeah, I did own my own land when they gave me that loan. And it can be, getting loans and grants for infrastructure can be very, very difficult. I know, if you don't have, if you don't have access to land that you can purchase. But I would say that before I got that grant, I was renting the land for 3 years before I bought my own farm. And I was able to get access to other grants and get infrastructure. But the key was I bought it and put it in a way where I could take it with me. So for example, like when you build a greenhouse, sometimes people will actually put the ground posts in concrete. And at that point, you're never pulling it back out. So doing things like, for example, just putting them in the ground with just stakes. So I knew because I knew I was going to leave at some point because I was renting that farm. So trying to put things in a way where I knew I could take them back apart and bring them with me. I believe the FSA, though, all the FSA requires is that you have a signed lease that you can show them. So as long as you can show them that you're going to be on that farm for a period of time, they'll generally be willing to work with you and help you out.
Oh, okay. So FSA, okay, let's just assume, I'm just making up numbers here.
Yeah.
So say a high tunnel costs $5,000.
Yeah.
And, this is the first year of operation, and, Big River as an incubator program, up to 3 years, we can be there. Now, if at the first year, if I decide to apply for a loan, would they even consider me? If so, what should I show them? In terms of accounts and records and everything? Or is it that only after a year when you show, then they'll say, oh, you're going to be there only for 2 more years, so we're not going to give you. Is that
So generally what they'll be looking for when you do the loan is that if you're a beginning farmer, either that you can show you had some experience working on farms, or don't quote me on this, but I think the fact that you're inside of an incubator program, like if you could get a letter signed by somebody at Big River, that'll go a really, really long ways. Because what they want to know is that you have enough support to use the money wisely. And so if you've been farming for long enough, you just show your business records. But in your situation, what I would ask about is they have a micro loan program, and that's for farmers that need less than $35,000. And it's a lot less paperwork, and the requirements are a lot looser as far as who they're willing to lend to. And I think that would be worth looking into for sure. You know, bare minimum, they can definitely make you loans for buying things like seed and things like that, but they also may be willing to do the infrastructure too. I just don't know off the top of my head how much, how long you need access to that land before they'll help you purchase a building or something like that.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments, discussion? We have a few minutes left.
It was a very, very useful session. Thank you for
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ariel, for doing this, taking the time to present on this topic. It was so refreshing too to hear from another past farmer, and yeah, thank you.
No, I'm very happy to, and I would say too that, I mean, please feel free to utilize me as a community member. So if you ever have any questions or you need anything, I'm more than happy to help. And somebody said, what would your in-person pitch be like? So that's a great question. So yeah, so my in-person pitch would be not too dissimilar from that kind of verbal pitch I gave, but I think you need to read the room a little bit more when you're doing that. So I would say, for example, it's always great if you meet somebody in person and you can reference something that you can find in common with them. And even if what's in common with them is, hey, I ate at your restaurant and it's great, or hey, I drive by that co-op every day. Like, it doesn't matter what it is, but I think having some sort of in with somebody, because it's just human nature that once they find a commonality with somebody, they want to help more. So for me, like, I think with the Whole Foods guy, when I went to go talk to him, I think I probably led with something similar to like, oh, hey, I drive by that store in St. Paul all the time. It looks so nice. You know, how can I sell you produce? And even just that little bit of like complimenting a store this person works at, I think helps a lot with kind of softening people, you know, and putting down the shields a little bit and being willing to listen and talk more openly with you. Because again, I think human beings all want to help each other, you know, at a base level. So I think we just need to kind of form that connection so they actually know who they want to help.
Hello.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Nathaniel.
Hey, everyone. I just wanted to weigh in. I guess for others, I guess the problem becomes you may be comfortable speaking in a certain arena, but then in another arena, you just don't know how to navigate. So it becomes like a little challenge and something I guess you have to work on to be able to utilize those effective techniques that you had just mentioned to us. So I guess it's just being bold, being brave, and just
Mm-hmm.
going and get it, I guess, because you know.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Nathaniel.
I think that's great. And I think it's so great to point out that, well, first of all, I love the motto going bold and being brave. I think that's wonderful. And yeah, I just want to say that even for me, like, I teach classes on this now. It was not comfortable for me when I started, and it still isn't sometimes. I mean, you might walk into somebody and just for whatever reason, you're having a bad day and you don't feel as open as you normally are. But I can definitely promise you all that the more you practice it and the more you practice talking about it, the easier it gets, for sure.
Yeah, definitely continuing to practice. And also, if you're a farmer, that's going to be going to the farmer's market, the Kingsfield Farmers Market, and selling your produce there. This is a perfect opportunity to sell your produce in that way, to have your pitch there as well, to kind of start practicing that.
And I'll do everybody one better. I would have a challenge if any of you go to the Kingsfield Farmers Market, which is there are at least 3 restaurants I can think of on that block that are next to the Kingsfield Farmers Market. And there's at least 2 I can think of that sell at Kingsfield. So even if it's just for practice, try to give yourself the opportunity to talk to somebody while you're there. You're really in your element when you're at the farmer's market. You got your produce, you're in farmer mode. It's a great opportunity to kind of try to put yourself because if you're feeling right now like this feels impenetrable, like you can't see yourself doing it, just take tiny steps, and maybe it just means at the farmer's market, you go talk to another vendor about your produce. But just start taking small steps. Don't feel like because you feel too scared of the whole thing that you can't just do a little bit and work your way up.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I noticed about Quincy is that the actual customer takes you out of your own comfort zone, like because they wanna engage with who they're buying their food from. They don't want to talk to you specifically regarding what you're selling, but if sometimes they just want to have a human conversation with you. So tomato, you might be buying basil, but it might be asking you, or where you grow, or and you're explaining to them we're part of a Big River team and this is what we do. It gives us opportunity, and it's just something because they know some of us are new, and we're trying to like get into like really navigating into a live social selling event. So they come to you and try to make you relax, let you know, and in a way, after they're gone, and you realize, oh, that's what they were trying to do. They're just trying to make me, relax.
Yes, that's great advice. That's totally true too at the farmer's market. Those connections. Yeah, thank you so much.
I'd say, of course. Becca, if you wouldn't mind, if people don't already have it, just providing my email address and everything to folks.
Oh, sure.
Like I said, I'd be thrilled to talk with anyone. And I think also as you get into the growing season, you're probably going to find new questions and new issues as you start talking to more buyers. And then I'm totally happy to start workshopping with folks or, talking about ideas. Because I know it looks really hard because you go out there, who am I going to talk to? What am I going to say? They're going to buy my stuff. But yeah, I've got an enormous amount of respect and care for what all you are all doing out at Big River and what you're providing for the community. So I'm happy to support any way I can.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for offering that. Definitely. I will give them your email and the follow-up email I send tomorrow.
Cool.
Great. Any other questions before we end the meeting?
May I say something?
Thank
Hi.
you.
We're cheating out here.
At the farm
Hi.
together. Perfect.
Oh.
Oh,
I'm jealous. This is the time of year to be in a greenhouse. So nice.
right. Yeah, we all went to we had our greenhouse orientation on Saturday and a bunch of our new farmers came and it was just so nice to finally be in person and everyone was so excited and there's so much joy and it was just, yeah, it was so much fun.
One of the best feelings in the world is being in a warm greenhouse when it's cold outside. It is.
Yes.
It's just being in a t-shirt where everybody else has to be in a snow jacket is great.
Yeah, it is really, really nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's getting busy at the farm. I'm going to end interpretation so we can have Mario and Andreas. There we go.
Entonces ya me pueden escuchar.
Gracias, Andrés.
Sí, de nada, Mario. Entonces, despídase, ya se van todos. Mario is saying thank you very much for the information.
Yeah.
Oh, great. De nada.
Adiós, Mike, adiós, todos.
Goodbye,
Hasta
everybody.
luego, Mario.
Hasta luego.
Bye, bye.
Good night. Buenas noches.
Okay, feliz noche. Sí, adiós. Buenas noches.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ariel and Becca. It was very interesting.
Of course. Thank you.
See you sometime.
Thank you so much, Andreas.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you.
Bye.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much again. That was so great.
Of course.
really-
Yeah, thanks for
Easy to digest all that information. I feel like sometimes it can be really like hard to understand, but it was so easy to digest. And marketing is really new to me, so I learned a whole
Yep.
lot.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and seriously, I'm always, if you need me to come in again or talk about anything else, I'm more than happy to.
Yeah, thank you so much for offering that. Definitely. Yes.
Well, hopefully I'd love to come out at some point once things are growing and just say hi to everybody. I haven't been out to Big River in almost 3 years, I think. So, I mean, that would be
Yeah,
about right.
there's always someone around. So we have Pierce and Eleanor that live on the farm, and they also farm at Big River Farms. They're the caretakers of the land. And May is always there, and so is Emilio. And then, some of the other staff are there off and on, but there's always somebody there. So yeah, feel free to show up, and we'd love to have you there.
Oh yeah, no, totally. That's great. Yeah, I'm gonna have to quote, was May saying she didn't go home, she got too distracted at the greenhouse and she forgot to go home? That's a very real feeling.
Yes, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what she said. And yeah, she's at the farm a lot.
That's great. Yeah, that's
Yeah, she's having a lot of fun starting her seeds, and yeah, I think she's really excited for the growing season. So
yeah, I mean, it's been a long winter. I'm
it has.
excited. I'm excited just
Yeah,
to see
it
it.
feels like
Yeah.
spring is, hopefully it's here. I don't know. I know people are starting to tap trees, and yeah.
This is
Yeah.
always, I was telling a friend, I mean, this is about when I'd start my greenhouse every year, and it was
Yeah.
50-50. Like some years I couldn't open the greenhouse doors because there was so much mud. And some years I had to like hire like a snow plow just to like get into the greenhouse.
Yeah.
It was just so, well, you were in Ashland. You probably had that even crazier than I did.
Yeah, I think, yeah, like it was lots and lots of snow. It wasn't, it wouldn't get so cold necessarily, but the snow, like the amount of snowfall was so much sometimes.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
due to the lake and everything. But yeah.
Well, cool. Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, we'll definitely stay in touch and let me know if you need anything.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much again. It was great.
Of course. Well, have a good evening.
Yep.
All right, bye.
Bye.